How's this for a list? The Angels, Jimmy Barnes, Jimmy Little, Mondo Rock, Australian Crawl, Richard Clapton, Gangajang, and even Tiny Tim. It's a list of artists our next guest on the Breakdown.net has worked with in their heyday and who still continues to make inroads to this day. Buzz Bidstrup first came to national attention as the drummer of one of Australia's most prominent and most important bands, The Angels. The classic lineup of Buzz on drums, the late Chris Bailey on bass, Rick Brewster on lead guitar, John Brewster on rhythm guitar, and the one and only Bernard Doc Neeson on vocals were seldom bettered in the beer barns of the 70s and 80s all over Australia. Buzz has written a book. It's called No Secrets, an Oz rock memoir of music and mayhem. Welcome to the Breakdown.net, Buzz.
Wonderful, Costa. Lovely to be with you. Good to see you again.
What takes you to Uluru? How come you're there?
I'm here for the 40th handback, 40th anniversary of the handback of the rock. So we do a lot of work here with this organisation. And we do work with kids in the school and in the college and with the local band in the community. So we've been getting them ready for performances at the concert on the weekend and also just doing a general kind of music program, which then dovetails into our nutrition education programs.
So the nutrition education thing is called Good Tucker?
Yes,
is that
it
right?
is, yep.
Tell us about that.
Well, the Good Tucker is basically what we came to when I was working with Jimmy Little. We originally started doing some advocation for dialysis units in remote communities because the dialysis problem out here is pretty large. And then we realised that maybe we should have an education program for kids so that maybe they don't get pre-diabetic by the time they're 15, which is what was happening. So that's what Good Tucker is, and we have an app that goes on the phone, which you zap a barcode in a store, and it either goes, that's a good food, that's not so good, or that's a bad one. And that's been really successful. But it's really about just getting kids to eat more fruit and vegetables, drink more water instead of sugar drink, and get a bit of exercise. That's been the main thrust for the last 15 years of this program.
So how did you become involved initially with Jimmy Little?
Very, very lucky. I was sitting in an office at one stage. I just finished a management stint with a girl called Diana Arnade, which had gone sort of okay, but, it had run its course. And I was thinking to myself, okay, I wonder what I'll do now. And a friend of mine just said, oh, look, come and just sit in the office here. They were a major booking agency called Allied Artists. And just come and, take a desk here. We'll pay you to come and book some people and stuff. At the very same time, Mark Callahan from Gangajang had taken a job at Festival Records. And he rang me up and said, we're putting out this record by Jimmy Little, and we need someone just to look after his book, meaning if he wants to do some gigs or somebody wants him to play, they need someone just to sort of help out. So I said, yeah, sure. And I went in to meet him. And the moment I met him, I knew there was another reason I was meeting him. It wasn't just about music. It was more about this whole inclusion that he had within Indigenous Australia, which I knew about. I knew about the importance of the man. But as I started to work with him and do, as everyone that followed that record Messenger knows, it sort of went on to Triple J. The whole new, bunch of kids wanted Jimmy Little to come out and sing to them. So I was sort of booking gigs in all of these wild, sort of crazy, groovy places. And I took him around the world with WOMAD tour and everything. It was just a lucky thing that Mark was working at Festival when that record came out, and I was working at an agency. But within moments of meeting that man, it just changed my life. And I ended up in places like I am now at Uluru, looking at communities. And I said to him one time, were they always like this, kind of dysfunctional and kind of, run down? And he said, yep, pretty much. And I went, man, so that hasn't changed. So that's what informed what we do.
Tell us about The Stunning Surprise, which is a chapter in the book.
Which is a chapter in the book. But, in films, when something happens to the character it's out of the ordinary. It's a surprise, right? That's what some people who write films call the stunning surprise, that here it comes, and that was my stunning surprise, was meeting Jimmy Little and then sending me off on this journey, which I've just enjoyed so much. I love what I do. I love coming out to places like this. I love meeting people. I love playing music. So, we use music to engage kids. What better way to live your life, really?
What was it like playing with Jimmy? Because you also played
Yeah, I
drums
did. Look, it was
with Jimmy.
fantastic. It had lots of funny stories. Things like, he would never have a set list. He didn't really want a set list.
Yeah.
So he would just sort of walk out on stage, have a look at the audience and go, I think we should play that song. And so the band was sort of ready, always ready to jump into, and sometimes he'd say, oh, this one's in G, fellas. And he'd play a song that maybe he played when he was, 20 or something, like, some old song that we'd probably, some of the guys in the band have never heard before. But it's in G, fellas, and he'd just start playing, and everyone's craning around trying to find out what chord he was playing. so that was kind of interesting. But it was just, I got to sing with him, and it was just like a beautiful moment just to sing with Jimmy Little. It was gorgeous.
Amazing voice.
Oh,
too,
yeah, beautiful voice, and his whole demeanor, everything about the man was special.
If we go way, way back, I was really happy to find out that you used to sit on the floor with a pair of drumsticks next to the radiogram, as they were
Yes.
called back then, and bang things to the music, because that's exactly what I did.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So that's how your drumming career
That's
started?
how it started, man. And with also with my brothers, I had older brothers. One was 8 years older than me, so I was born in 1952. So by the time the late 50s came around, my brother was listening to everything that was on the radio, and he was buying records like Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line, and all of these records that get I guess a lot of people of that age group, who are 8 years older than me, were listening to, and that was what was, Buddy Holly and Elvis and all of that was informing people's music choices. I got to hear that when I was 8, so that was something that just kept pushing me. I knew about all of this music when I was very young.
It's such a privilege to grow up in a household that has music going all the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it really does form in a lot of ways who you are.
Yeah, definitely. And my dad listened to classical music, so I got to hear a lot of that. My mum listened to things like, South Pacific and My Fair Lady and all of that stuff. So I got to hear all of that. And my father was also into comedy. So he was into the Goon Show, and he was into Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and like all of those people. So I got all of that stuff as well. So it was a pretty good education.
And you managed to meet Charlie Watts along the way as
How
well.
funny.
Tell us that story.
How funny. Man, when the Rolling Stones came to Adelaide in 65, when the Beatles came to Adelaide, they had like 100,000 people in the streets. So they thought, okay, we're not going to let the Rolling Stones stay in the middle of Adelaide. We'll put them in this little motel on the way, as you're driving into Adelaide down Glen Osmond Road, off through the hills and drive into Adelaide. There's this little motel, tiny little motel, one story, but it happened to be around the corner from where I lived. And this kid came up on his bike. We used to ride our bikes around the place. And he said, hey, the Rolling Stones are just down at the Arkaba Court. And I said, yeah, right, of course they are, He said, no, the Rolling Stones are there now. So I rode myself around the corner, like 300 metres or something away. Rode around the corner, almost ran over Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman and Brian Jones, who were standing on the corner of this little bloody Adelaide street having a cigarette. And I rode up to Charlie and I said, hey, I'm a drummer just like you. I want to be in a band just like you. And he said, well, you keep practicing, mate, and you'll get there. And I thought that was so nice. And then Bill Wyman sort of looking at me, and I had this sort of another thing up my sleeve. I said, I really like your album 12 by 5. And Bill Wyman said, how old are you? I said, I think I was 12, I think at the time, or 11 or something. And I said, yeah. And he said, how do you know that record? It's only just been released. And I said, my sister's friend had it and she didn't like it and she gave it to me. And, and I rattled off all the names of the songs and everything. And they couldn't believe that this little kid in Adelaide knew all of their songs.
Fantastic. Yeah. What a great story. Now, you started doing a fair bit of session work. That was mostly how you got into contemporary music, was it?
I started playing in bands really when I was 14. So I ended up in this band of guys who were older than me. They were like 18, 20. And I got into it because we used to rehearse in the same place that they did. They would rehearse after us. So they would get to see us play just as they turned up, right? Anyway, one day, one of these guys, the bass player, said, "Hey, our drummer can't make it this week. Would you stay around and play drums?" So, yeah, I'll do that. That's fine, as long as it's okay with my brother, because he's coming to pick me up. I was 14. He's coming to pick me up, as long as he's okay to hang around. He happened to go to university with this guy. He was studying with us, so he knew him. So that was all good. I played that day. Then they said, "Oh, would you come back next week? Can we do it again next week?" And what I didn't know is that they wanted to get rid of their drummer, and they'd seen me and they thought, this kid's pretty good. So, the next week I did the same thing again. And then the next minute I'm asked to join this band who were called Fahrenheit 451. And they turned out to be one of the most successful bands in Adelaide at the time, like a cover band. We played top 40 music. We'd play 4 or 5 nights a week. And I was 14 when I joined it. So 15, I'm at school, and I'm in this band that's a very successful band. So that's how I got into it. I got into it through playing in bands, but I did my session work later.
Must have been fantastic, hanging out with those older boys too at the time. I mean, you would have learned a few things in a hurry.
I learned some good things and some not so good things. Well, it depends which way you look at it. But yeah, look, they were really good harmony singers. They did lots of Holly songs and Beatles and so they knew how to sing. So they actually got me into singing, which was really good. They taught me how to sing harmony, how to pick harmonies. They were good musicians, nice guys, So yeah, I was really lucky that everything worked out for me in that sense. Yeah.
You're on the breakdown. I'm talking to Graham Buzz Bidstrup for his book No Secrets that's out now, an Oz rock memoir of music and mayhem. I got to say, Buzz, one great thing that I didn't think about when I started reading the book is because, sometimes the book's in the bedroom or it's in the lounge room or it's in the kitchen or wherever I put it down from reading, and you walk past it and No Secret starts going through your head. I'm hearing the song all the time, and then I'm going all the way through, kind of through the first side of the album.
Oh,
it was amazing, that stuff. It just sticks in your head, Yeah. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it's a good title.
I really enjoyed it.
Lovely.
It is a great title, and it's a great song. We'll get to that in a moment. You finished school, you did some session work and all that stuff, and then you went off to London.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, yeah. I had the, as most kids, of that time, they want to get away and, check out the rest of the world. I was probably 23, I think. Off I went, and I finished my last exam. I studied mechanical engineering, mechanical design, and I finished my last exam. The next day I was on a flight to London. Didn't even find out if I passed, which I did actually, but that's another story. But, I got to London right at the time of the transition between what was, you would call West Coast kind of hippie, denim music, Eagles and all that kind of stuff. And there was also disco, which was, it was still pretty big. But then one day I went to this little place called the Nashville Room in West Kensington, where I was living. It was right around the corner from where I was living. And this band got up and started playing, and I went, God damn, those, they're so different. And it was the Stranglers. And the Stranglers had this kind of thing where they had an organ player, playing a bit, they were sort of a bit like the Doors on acid or more than acid, like, quite, and the singer was, Hugh Cornwell was kind of spitting at everybody and, spitting out his words, and the bass player looked like he would kill you if you looked at it in the wrong way. And the drummer was amazing, Jet Black. He was an older guy, and he'd just sort of sit at the back and he'd just be playing away. So I saw the Stranglers, and then I saw people like Ian Jury. He had a band called Kilburn and the High Roads. So I saw him. I saw Graham Parker. I saw the Sex Pistols play at, by mistake. I didn't go to see them. I went to see another band, Eddie and the Hot Rods, who were playing at the Marquee Club. And, this Sex Pistols got up and played half a dozen songs before him. And so, I'm sort of seeing this stuff.
Amazing.
Yeah, I'm seeing this stuff and I'm going, man, this is incredible, right? I just wanted to play rock music again. It reminded me of the sort of music that I played when I was 13, 14, things like Them, Mystic Eyes and Gloria and, all of those kind of songs, a bit punky, like The Who, the way that Keith used to play and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I was trying to work out whether I'd stay there or come back to Australia and start a band.
How much did that kind of inform what you played, a couple of years later with the Angels? I mean, songs like I Ain't the One, Coming Down, Take a Long Line, Shadow Boxer,
Yeah.
they're punk songs.
Yeah, they are.
Or-
They've got that energy of it. The lyrics aren't so much punky, but the start of Take a Long Line, I mean, that's a lift from the Ramones, mate. I just
Yeah.
I just went, man, I just want to be, I'd love to have been in the Ramones. God damn, I love that band. How much it informed me when I got back to Australia and joined the Angels. They didn't play that kind of music. Their music, the first album of the Angels, if you listen to it, it's got some old jug band songs. It's got some country kind of songs. And when I sat down with John, the first night I was in the band, we were in Mount Gambier, and he said, "Oh, do you write songs?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got a few bits and pieces, And the stuff that I had was what I'd started writing in London before I'd seen those other bands. So it was a little bit country, sort of. There was a song called Shelter from the Rain, which is on the first album that I wrote with John. Another one called Can't Get Lucky, which is a different kind of song. The Angels didn't get that sort of punky thing until later, so that was on Face to Face, and we worked really hard on that.
Yeah.
I was quite happy for us to play the music. I didn't necessarily want to look like a punk or put safety pins through my nose or anything like that, but I certainly loved playing that kind of music. So I'm glad the Angels, everybody ended up sort of heading that way, which was good.
The first time I saw the Angels on Sounds or Sounds Unlimited, I think it was, with Donnie Sutherland on Saturday afternoon or something on one of the commercial channels. I'm sure it was Am I Ever Going to See Your Face Again? And Doc had this like sunburst kind of big medallion on, and he was playing bass then, wasn't he? He was playing Rickenbacker bass.
Yeah, that's right. So he was the bass
then.
player when I joined.
Is that
the band.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. It was a 4-piece band when I joined it. Yeah, so Doc was the bass player. Yeah, look, I had worked with Chris Bailey before I went to London. And that's the session stuff that you were talking about. So Chris and I used to do sessions in Adelaide. When I joined what used to be called the Keystone Angels, he said to me, that band, mate, they're not that good, Why are you doing that? And I said, because I'm going to get to Sydney. I'm going to go to Albert's. There's Vander and Young. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to learn how to record. What better place could I learn how to record than at Albert's? He said, all the people in Adelaide will think you've sold out, that you've joined the Keystone Angels. And that's why I called myself Buzz Throckman. And I explain it in the book. Of why I did that. So there's a good explanation of why I became Buzz Throckman and how I came up with the name. But that's another story. We started recording with the 4-piece band, and I was the only guy that had a tape recorder that could play the tapes that came out of the studio. I had a quarter-track machine, right? I bought it in London, brought it back to Australia. So I used to sit there with Doc. I was staying at his house at the time, and we'd go in and record some stuff, and then come back and I'd play it. And I'd say, now, Doc, you see here, when it gets to this bit, you're playing this part, and it doesn't kind of fit with what I'm playing. So, we've got to talk about that. And Doc, God love him, gorgeous man, wasn't a great bass player. I could never get it to work. And then one day he was telling me about how he'd studied drama and he'd studied acting and everything. And I said, have you ever thought about being out the front, like being a front man? And he said, oh, yeah, maybe. He said, but who'd play the bass? And I said, I know who could play the bass, Chris Bailey. So we had a meeting with the Brewster brothers, and John said, well, I'm probably a better singer. And I said, yeah, well, you might be a technically better singer, but you don't look like that guy. You're not 6'4" and drop dead gorgeous and with this voice and charisma. And I said, that's what you need in a front man. So he should be the front man, right? And then John said, yeah, but who would we get to play bass? And I said, Chris Bailey. And he said, Chris Bailey's never going to leave Adelaide to come and play with us, because Chris was kind of a bit cool, He was like, he was Chris Bailey, right? And I said, actually, I think he would, because I'd already asked him. I'd already said to him, here's some of the new songs we're doing, right? I sent him a cassette of it. And I said, would you come and play with us if I could get you a gig? And he said, yeah, okay. So that's how Chris got into the band. And as soon as Chris got
Yep.
into the band, we were away because I had a bass player. Like he and I could play anything. We could play any groove, any style. We didn't ever have to talk about are we in sync or, you know, we never had to talk about that. It just happened. So it was beautiful.
It's an amazing feeling when a drummer and a bass player, and when you're one of them, when you know that it's just sitting in the pocket, it's beautiful.
It's just in the pocket, and then you put this little base for everything else to grow on. And like building a building, if you
Yeah.
haven't got a good basement, if you haven't got a strong foundation, nothing's going to work. So having Chris, it was what we needed. It completed the band. The Angels, in my opinion, didn't become the Angels until Chris joined, and then, you know, that
Chris joined and Doc's up front,
Doc's out
and
front.
then, you know, the rest, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because he was an amazing front man, wasn't
Definitely, and he had so much to give, and he did so much. He transformed from, you know, what I'd say the mild-mannered Irishman, you know, into this manic guy out the front of a crazy kind of hybrid punk rock band. You know, because we weren't really a punk band, we weren't a full rock band. We were kind of a bit more. You know, with Doc, we were more like a art rock band with Doc because he gave us that focus of being just a bit different. And yeah, sure, the band, you know, we had a couple of guys with leather jackets and, you know, sunglasses and stuff, but you know, we weren't really punks. You know, everyone, they were all kind of private schoolboys.
And back in the day, with Countdown being so prominent back then, someone like Doc, and, you know, if you want to go to some of the other bands around at the time, you know, Bon Scott in front of AC/DC, Shirl in front of Skyhooks, you know, how important it was back then in the Australian music scene to be prominent on Countdown. And Doc just, you know, I can still see those
Yeah.
you know, performances and stuff like that in my head.
Yeah, he was mesmerizing, and you could just see the kids in the audience, and I would see that in the shows too. Like, you know, watching the Angels audience transform from being mildly interested in what we were doing to being rabidly following us. And it was basically Doc. Our music was good, but without that focus, without that person, I'd be sitting behind him playing drums, and I could see that every eye in the place was looking at him. You know, they weren't looking at us, and that was fine. They were looking at him, and he was delivering. And every time he'd do something a bit weird or a bit funny or whatever it was, the whole audience would be with him, and that would just elevate our whole thing. Yeah.
I used to love his asides, or whatever it was, you know, between songs. He'd babble on about something. You know, I can remember one, you know, I see no ships, and then, you know, you blasted into something.
Yeah, that's it. And sometimes you know you just sort of wonder, is he going to say anything else? You know, and sometimes I'd start off, you know, and he'd look around at me as if to say, "Oh shit, mate, I was about to say something else," you know. So I'd say, "Well, just let me know," you know, so I don't start too soon.
You had some real success in those early years, but unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of money coming your way, was there? It seems that was a bit of a recurring theme. Things weren't really evenly divided up
No,
among the band.
no. Look, you know, I think today, and my son is a producer and a content maker, and you know he does stuff, and he makes beats, right? So he makes music, and then somebody else does what they call a top line, and that's a melody and a lyric. Now sometimes top liners could get paid 20%, 30% of a song. That means that the rest of it should go to the people that make the music, right? And that's what happens today. Back in the 1970s and into the 80s, the making the music, like when the band would sit in a rehearsal room, and we did plenty of that. I mean, believe me, we did plenty of that. Just going, you know, and we'd be playing that. And then all of a sudden, now Chris would say, for God's sake, go to another chord, you know, go to a D. And I'd say, yeah, and follow it with an E, you know, D, E, D, E, A, da, 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 da. You know, so we'd make up these tracks, right? And all of us would do it. All of us would be working on it. Then we'd go into the studio and we'd record it. No, the chorus shouldn't be there. We should have another verse in there, and we should put this here, and da, and we'd end up with this piece of music. And then usually Doc, sometimes Rick, would top line over it. They would go into their book and they'd find some lyrics and but a lot of times we'd help them with the melodies as well. We'd just throw in, and why don't when you go like this when you get to there, or why don't you change that chord, or blah, blah, blah. So we were actually helping them to make the music, but because the records came out as produced by the Angels and Mark Opitz, who was our engineer, they said, well, that's your credit, like you don't get anything for the songwriting. But as we all know now, there's a certain royalty that gets paid to the songwriters that is usually totally free of any kind of deduction. The royalties that are paid to the band are the ones that all the deductions come from, meaning, right? So when I was trying to put a deposit on a $70,000 unit in Sydney, my bandmates were buying $1 million houses and our manager was buying a $2 million house. So I figured that there was something wrong with that equation, that somebody was making, and all of the public performance money, every time the song got played on the radio, the songwriters would get money, not the band, the songwriters. So, they were making quite a lot more money, than I was. And I said to them, well, look, I know there are bands like Mental as Anything and others who have a songwriting split from the songwriters back to the people that don't write as much, just to sort of say, hey, thanks for coming into the studio. Thanks for the rehearsing. Thanks for touring around the countryside, making $20 a day, helping us make it all work. And I suggested that we should have one of those, and they said no. And that was in 1978, it was start of 79. So I just said, look, if you're not going to do that, I might have to review my options, so to speak. By the time we got to America in 1980, we'd lost what I called the esprit de corps. We'd lost that thing about 5 people. When we made Face to Face, all 5 of us and Mark Opitz and George Young and Harry Vander all wanted to make the Angels the biggest band they could. By the time we got to America, I was trying to work out how the hell I could get out of there, because I was making $20 a day. And everything that we were advanced to go and do that came out of the royalties for the band, not the songwriting royalties. And I explain in chapter 1, or in what's called the prologue, I explain what that was all about, So it wasn't it wasn't, and it's broken up so many bands, that exact same thing.
Well, it's not like you're sitting in the rehearsal room, rolling joints or something, waiting for everything to happen.
No, you're sitting there playing the whole time.
I think that was one of the things that George Martin always made sure, that Ringo always had a song or 2 on every record, so he got some of that.
Yeah, he did. He did. And
those royalties.
But, he came up with the title for Hard Day's Night, and he came up with 8 Days a Week. They were his titles. Like, he used to say them. They used to call them Ringo's malapropisms, and, they'd say he used to say stuff like that. Well, goddamn, I can't see his name on that song. He came up with the title.
And things didn't really change when you got back together,
With the Angels.
When was that? Like with the Angels?
Yeah, 2008. It was.
I mean, you were still told things like shut up and play drums.
That's it.
And that you were a distraction.
Yeah, I know. And because I used to ask, when we had the reunion, I'd been running a charity for 8 years, so I knew exactly what accountability and governance, I knew what all of that was about. And when somebody says, do you want to go and do a 20-date tour? Well, the first question I ask is, can I see the budget? And they wouldn't show me the budget. And it's like, what do you mean I can't see the budget? Oh, you're just going to cause trouble. And I go, no, I just want to know what your budget looks like, because if your budget doesn't add up, which it didn't sometimes, I've got to say, when it doesn't add up, you go, why am I doing this? I'm just going to, we're going to end up just running around for no real reason. And I wasn't really that keen on just, using the Angels name just for the sake of it, just to make money. I thought the Angels had a legacy that had something, they should have been elevated a bit more. And that's why when we had our first meeting, I said, the cold chisel model. And the cold chisel model was, you don't just go out and keep playing, going round and round and round and round. You play a gig, Then you wait for people to go, can we have another gig? And you go, here's another gig, and then you wait. And then if you play it the right way, you end up doing less gigs to more people, and you still make the same amount of money. In fact, you make more money. So if it's about money, you'll make more money. But if it's about keeping the legacy of the band and the name and keeping that, sacred in a sense, then look at Cold Chisel. That's the best way that, I've ever seen that people have looked after it.
You're listening to Graham Buzz Bidstrup, who's got a great book out now called No Secrets. Go and get yourself a copy. It's an Ausrock memoir of music and mayhem, and you're listening to The Breakdown. Now, New Year's Eve at the Opera House should have been a good fun.
Would have been. You'd think so, wouldn't you? You'd think that that'd be...
Wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd think that'd be fun. Can you imagine 100,000 people in the forecourt, about 3 toilets, no food, and the audience could bring eskies full of alcohol? There's a recipe for disaster right there.
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? So, yeah, look, it was probably one of the worst nights of my life on stage. It was really frightening because I had no idea. I couldn't see anything. All I could see was bits of glass were breaking on the thing behind me and on my drums. And just at the time when Chris had kicked a bottle over to our manager on the side of the stage going, this is what's happening here. People are throwing stuff at us. He turned around and got a champagne bottle right here, and it just knocked him out.
And then poor old Doc got smacked with.
He got smacked with a piece of
masonite
that was on the. There was a hoarding on the front of the stage for AGL gas, I think, and people were just breaking that off. It was masonite and just frisbeeing it at people. Go figure.
If you find it difficult to understand that stuff, don't you?
Yep, definitely.
Why you throw something? You've waited there all day to see this band,
and now people,
and you start pegging stuff at them.
And surely there were people in the audience that could see who was doing it. I just don't know why somebody didn't say, "Hey guys, just bugger off,"
Just
settle down. Yeah.
Tell us about the darkroom sessions, because you were pretty keen on taking the band in a different direction then, weren't you? You were pretty keen on getting some keyboards and different textures in the band.
Yeah, look, I'd sort of suggested that when we did No Exit, that there was a Hammond organ in the studio, and maybe we should, have it. Rick was a really good piano player, by the way. Like, he's in a Stedford grade piano player. And I kept saying to him, hey, man, you're really good. Why don't you put some piano? He said, we don't need piano. I said, well, what about organ? That's kind of cool. So we got a couple of songs with organ on them, No Exit. But when we came to Darkroom, I wanted to continue that. I was more keen on us becoming a new wave band rather than trying to copy punk music, which is what Face to Face, we copied it a bit when we did the, half a dozen, well, maybe 4 songs on Face to Face. No Exit had a few rejects from Face to Face on it. So it sounded a bit similar except for the organ, which was good. Then we got to Darkroom. I remember going into the first rehearsal with our producer or co-producer, John Boylan, who would have been a great producer for our first album, actually, because he did people like Linda Ronstadt and blah, 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 and like he was into that mode, so he would have been a perfect guy to do our first album. Anyway, he is now doing our 4th album. Wrong producer, nice guy, wrong producer. So, I was determined that any song that I had a piece of the songwriting in, I wanted to co-produce. And one of them was No Secrets that I'd written with Doc. And I went into the rehearsal room, and I had to get there first because I had to set up drums. And I said to John Boylan, hey, did you get a cassette of all of the songs that we're going to do? And he said, yeah. He showed it to me, and I looked down the list, and I couldn't see No Secrets there. And I said, oh, did they talk about a song called No Secrets? He said, no. I said, oh, okay, because it's a good song. And he said, oh, well, have you got a copy of it? And I said, I happen to have one right here. And I played it to him, and he said, man, that's a great song. He said, why isn't that on the list? I said, I don't know. And he said, oh, no, we've got to work that one up. When we started rehearsing, the first thing he said is, hey, Buzz played me this song called No Secrets. I think we should start with that one. So we started with that one and got it all together. And when I got a chance to do the production on it, because I had a co-write, so it's like, I'm going to be a co-producer, right? So I tried to get a little bit of, we got the first time we'd ever had a clean Stratocaster guitar on an Angels track. Just a really straight, like, cling, and you can hear it at the start of No Secrets. You can hear it, it's sprung and it's backwards strung. And, I wanted to get some harmonies in there. I wanted to get other things that were more akin to maybe, Dave Edmunds might have done, on those kind of songs. Or that kind of production. It was great to actually get in there and be part of it again, because I was to start with. I just got locked out for a couple of albums.
Yeah.
So, back into it again, I thought, this is cool. And when it became successful, I thought that the next question would be, hey, have you got any more songs like that? Which I did have. But I didn't get that question. I didn't get, hey, have you got any more songs like that? It's sort of like, oh, well, you got one, so you should just be happy. And I thought, well, that's cool, but it's not about that. It's really about trying to get something together that becomes different for the Angels. And I think it was sort of different enough, but not quite different enough.
Yeah, when you go through to, like to Face the Day and Wasted Sleepless Nights and songs like that, they're such a,
they're the anomalies.
Departure.
Yeah, they're the anomalies, because Face the Day didn't sound like that when it was first played. Like the first time I heard that song, it just started and it did that and it stopped. And it was about, it was about 5 minutes long or something. And it was Chris's idea, with a bit of help from me, to take the chorus and make it go down in intensity. So instead of the chorus being up here somewhere, the chorus is down here. I don't want to face the day. So the chorus is opposite to how it normally is. So I think that made it really, really special.
And then that really locks into the drama from Doc as well, doesn't it? Because he played that part so well.
When he did the clip, how good's the clip for Face the Day? It's fantastic.
I'm trying to remember the timeline. When do you head off to the US? Have you already been to the US?
Well, we headed off in 1980. So we made Darkroom, and a decision was made to do a compilation of Face to Face and No Exit to make that our first release in America, which was a mistake. I think it was a mistake, because Face to Face had a shape. We spent a year making that record. So it had this whole kind of shape, and that record should have been released, I think it should have been released probably 2 years before it did. It should have been released when it was really popular in Australia. And we should have actually toured there when we had that esprit de corps, when we were all kind of like this, like united. That's when we should have toured America, not in 1980 when I was thinking about how the hell could I get out of here.
That must have been tough. A lot of things in front of you. You want everything to succeed, but your heart is just, I guess when you get on stage, all that's forgotten.
Yeah, all of that's forgotten when you get on stage, because when you get on stage, you look out at the people who've paid money to come and see you, and you can't do anything than give your best. If you don't give your best, then you're fooling yourself and you're fooling everybody. So it doesn't matter how bad you feel. And sometimes I must tell you that I'd go on stage after being, roasted and, people yelling at you and, saying all sorts of stuff. And you just go on stage and forget that and just go in and play.
Well, that's your job, isn't it?
That's it. That's what you're there for.
And the Kinks didn't like the Kinks weren't too happy with you.
No, they didn't. Poor old Ray Davies. He was such a sad old bastard. I tell you, I don't know why he was so paranoid about the fact that we were doing well, and I thought he should be happy that we're doing well.
Isn't that the support band's job, to get up there and get the crowd in a good mood?
That's it.
And ready for the headliner?
Yeah.
He was too scared about being blown away, I'd say.
I think he was too scared about that. He was a control freak. It was just such a pity because we were doing really well. And had we started on the East Coast, where nobody really knew us, it would have been a totally different thing. We wouldn't have been asked for encores. But because we started on the West Coast, where we'd played in Seattle 3 times before we went there with the Kinks, people knew about us. And there was half the people that came to see the Kinks that knew about the band.
You're over in the US, you play with the Kinks, they're not that happy, and now Cheap Trick as well.
Cheap Trick were
they were good guys.
Totally the opposite. They were great guys. When we were in Chicago, our truck got stolen. The truck with everything in it was stolen. And we had a gig that night, and we went on the radio to say, look, unfortunately, we won't be able to play tonight because we've just lost our truck with all of our gear, so we're going to have to cancel. Phone call comes into the radio station. Hey, it's Rick Neeson here from Cheap Trick. Angel City. Tell them that they can play. We'll have a whole set of gear there for them. So, Bunny Carlos sent me a drum kit. Rick sent guitars, amps, and they came along as well. They came along and played. So
Fantastic.
yeah, so they were really cool guys. They were great guys.
And a great band too.
Great band.
I was lucky enough to see them. Lucky enough to see them in Australia a few years. I think it was during COVID. I think they came back out, and they were such a good band. Such a good band live.
Yeah, I loved walking backstage when they were playing, and they had these big, like banks of amps. They used to have with the checkerboard on the front of them. Big banks. They looked like big banks of Marshall amps. When you walked around the back, he had a little Fender Twin that was sitting there. That's he used a tiny little amp.
Oh, fantastic! You've just blown the blown the facade. Yeah. That's fantastic.
And sometimes later on, they had a keyboard player on the side as well.
You're over there, and obviously you're playing. The band's playing well. On stage, it's all going well, but for you, it's falling apart, isn't it? I mean, you make a decision that you're going to leave the band.
Yep, I was given what I call a little golden pass. A little get out of jail free card by my friend Cameron Allen. And Cameron used to run Regular Records with Martin Fabini. And I'd met him because I did the first demos of Flowers. I produced these demos at Albert's one day, and that got them their deal with Regular Records. So Cameron knew about me. He knew that I knew how to engineer. He knew I played a bit of guitar and a bit of keyboard. And he just said to me, when we were sitting in the room at Gramercy Park Hotel, and he said, how's it going? And I said, mate, I'm making $20 a day. We've basically started at the ground level again. It's going to take us at least 3 years, or if more, to get anywhere in America and Europe. Every time that we go and do a tour, we get an advance, and the advance is taken out of the royalties that I would make, not out of the songwriting royalties, the old songwriting royalties thing again. So we worked out that we were $450,000 in debt in 1980, which is like about $2 million now, and that I'd have, we'd have to sell something like 4 million records before I'd make 1 cent, and if we made 4 million records, each songwriter would probably make $500,000 each. So Cameron said to me, hey, I've got all of these films to make. I'm doing the music for them. He said, why don't you come and work with me? He said, I'll pay you obscene amounts of money and we'll have lots of fun. What do you think? And I just went, man, that sounds pretty cool. Are you sure? And he said, yeah. And I went, phew. We went and had breakfast. We had to drive to Philadelphia that day in the bus. And as I'm walking towards the bus to get onto the bus, somebody said something to me that was a bit like, nah, I don't need that shit, It was something about, oh, you're not playing very well at the moment. And, I'm like, what do you mean I'm not playing very well? I always play the best I can. What are you talking about? I got on the bus and something in my head just went, Cameron's offer was actually pretty good. So I just went down and just resigned, and I said, I'm not going to walk out on you, but, when we get back to Australia, find yourself another drummer. And when you got yourself another drummer, I'm going to leave. And that was how it happened. I needed something to sort of hang on to. I didn't want to just leave and then join another band because I didn't really want to join another band. I wanted to make records. I wanted to be a producer. I wanted to engineer and do that. So doing the film music just gave me all of that. I could use all of those skills. It was the best move I ever made. I learned so much about engineering and about producing.
You're listening to Graham Buzz Bidstrup, who's got a great book out now called No Secrets. Go and get yourself a copy. You met Mark Callahan. You'd form a lifelong musical partnership that still exists.
Still goes,
today,
yeah.
Back in 1981 when Regular Records signed the Riptides, who were a band from Brizzy. So tell us that story.
Well, Cameron and the regular had signed the Riptides. Cameron said to me one day, "Oh yeah, we've got this band. They're pretty young and energetic, and like kind of a bit thrashy and stuff." He said, "I don't really want to produce them. Would you just produce some demos for them?" So I said, "Sure. That'd be fun." I recorded this stuff with them and got to know them all very well, and I recognised straight up that Mark was a great songwriter. I ended up doing pretty much all of the Riptides production stuff. A bit later on, I was the music director for Sweet and Sour for the ABC, and we needed a few more songs. So I rang up Mark and I said, "Hey, why don't you come around to my place and we'll write a couple of songs. We need a couple more songs for the show." And he turned up, and of course my wife Kay was there, and Kay and I had written songs, for several years, like. And then Chris Bailey turned up. So between us, the four of us, we wrote a couple of songs, which got into the show. But we also had a few other ideas that were kind of cool, and we decided that we would meet again sometime. And it turned out we all liked playing tennis. We would get together and play tennis for a couple of hours. Then we'd come back to my place and write a couple of songs. And over a period of 6 months, we ended up with a heap of songs and a band. And the band was a 4-piece band. So it was Mark and Chris and Kay and myself. And that's the band, or that's the unit that made Give Me Some Lovin'. It was our first single. That got released, and it was like, oh, somebody said, "Oh, now you got to go out and play live." And it's like, oh, goodness gracious, okay, we've got to play live. Okay, we haven't got a band. We didn't even have a name. We used to describe rhythms as like jang, 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 like that. And somebody said, you guys should be something gajang, which is the sound of the guitar, And Mark says, "Yeah, well, we're the gang that make the gajang." And so that's how we got the name. And then we got a keyboard player, Jeffrey, who's still in the band. And we had another guitar player, Gordon, for a while, and we started playing. And then we started making our album, and Gordon couldn't play, so we got Robert James. And then when Robbie James joined, that's when Gangajang became the 5-piece or 6-piece unit at the time, because Kay was in the band as well. So we had a 6-piece band that was pretty much the band that everyone saw for the first 3 years of us playing. So yeah, look, it was an amazing time, early 80s or mid 80s.
You finally got to put your drums in the big room at Rhinoceros Studios.
I did, yes, and as I describe in the book with Darkroom, I wanted to put them in that bloody big room, but they wouldn't let me. But I did. I got them in the big room, and you can hear it, pretty well in Giver of Life and songs like that.
Tell me about the first time you heard Sounds of Then.
Well, it was basically a poem that Mark had written about his time coming out from England and being put into a car by his parents and driven north from Brisbane. And they said, "When you find a place you like, that's where we'll live." And they drove into Bundaberg, and there's all these kids playing soccer. And of course, the kids, Mark and his brother being from England, they just said, "We want to live here. Everyone's playing soccer." So they got a little house, and the block was awkward, and it faced west, long diagonals and sloping too. And in the distance, in the heat haze, there were convoys of silence. There were cattle grazing, right? So Mark had written this poem about the house, about where it was, about how their family used to sit out on the patio and laugh and think they were in Australia. So I saw this little poem in his book, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, that's something that I'm working on for a record about my time, coming out from England." And I said, "Oh, yeah, And then a bit later on, he played me a little demo. He said, "I put some music to it." And I listened to it, and I went, "Man, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Like, we should do that." And he said, "Oh, no, I don't really want to do that song." And I said, "Oh, well, we've got to go out and play live. We need songs, and that's a good song, so why don't we just play it? Doesn't matter, we don't have to record it. We'll just, we'll play it, right?" So we played it, and it wasn't until Robbie James came in and put in that da 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 da, and the little waves of the delay, all of that stuff, that all of a sudden this song, and I got Reg Mombassa to play a slide in it, slide guitar. So I explained about all of that in the book, how he got into that. That song, which Mark didn't want to put on the first record, has probably been our most successful song. So I'm pretty sure he'd be very happy that we did put it on the record.
Well, it's a classic.
It
isn't
is.
It's an
It's turned
Australian
into
classic,
a real classic.
without doubt.
Yeah.
You're listening to Graham Buzz Bidstrup, who's got a great book out now called No Secrets. Go and get yourself a copy. We're going a bit forward here. So Jimmy Barnes and Jane Barnes meet. You're touring Soul Deep. You're Nathan Cavalieri. You've become Jimmy Little's agent, then manager, then managing director of the Jimmy Little Foundation.
Yeah.
The band's been inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame. There's a reunion tour with the classic lineup of the Angels, but then Doc's health starts to falter.
Yes, it was so sad. We'd already had our kind of spat, in the reformed Angels when Doc, in the nicest way to put it, sort of aligned with what I was thinking, that we shouldn't actually be doing gigs after gigs after gigs because they just kept doing the same gigs round and round. Like, we'd go back to the same venue after about 4 months or 5 months or something, and, there'd be 3/4 of the crowd. And you go, that's not right. That shouldn't be the Angels, like we should have a full house everywhere we go. And as Slim Dusty used to say, he wouldn't go back to the same place under 2 years. Doc had started to talk to me about how he wasn't very happy with how it was going. We said one time that we were offered a festival and we said, yes, let's do the festival. But I'd also had a thing that I used to go to each year called Gama Festival. Very important for the work that I do to be there.
Yep.
And I'd told them a year ago, I said, that weekend in August, I'm not available. So as it got closer and closer, guess what happened? Oh, we're going to do some more gigs on that weekend. And I said, to Doc, we should do the festival that we're offered because that's a big festival. We've got a fee. We fly down to Melbourne, do the festival, fly back, and I can fly to Arnhem Land and I can do the thing. He said, yep, I'm with you. The rest of the band said, no, we've got to do these little pub gigs. And I go, they're the same pub gigs we've done 6 months ago. Why are we doing them again? Number one. Number two, I've already told you I'm not available. And they said, oh, we'll get somebody else then. I said, you go ahead, get somebody else. I don't care. But I'm not doing it. And Doc said, I don't want to do it either. They had a band meeting without Doc and I and kicked us out. And I explain in the book how that happened. Once we were out of the band, Doc sort of said to me, so, would you help me make some more music? And I said, sure, no worries. And we started talking about stuff. And then the people who'd helped put the Angels back together again came calling and said, why don't you and Doc and other people who had been in the Angels start another band called the Angels 100% to combat the Brewster's Angels, right? And we said, I suppose, why not? And we had all of that together. We had a tour with Guns N' Roses. We had a tour with ZZ Top. We had everything in place. And then Doc was diagnosed with his brain tumor. And it was a question. Doc said, do you think I should get treatment for it? Or do you think I should do the tour? And I said, as much as I would like you to do the tour, I think you should make that decision yourself. If you think you need to get treatment right now, then that's what you should do. And that's what he did. He got the treatment that stopped the Angels 100%. So what could have been wasn't. But, unfortunately, Doc didn't get better despite. No. Yeah, it was very sad. Very, very sad.
And then in a reasonably short space of time, Chris Bailey dies, Doc dies, and Jimmy Little dies.
I know.
It must have been an amazingly tough time.
Time. It was really, I just felt like everything was falling away from underneath me. One thing I had said to Jimmy when he got really sick is that I would continue on the work that we'd started. With Doc, I just had to watch him basically fade away, and I was with him the night before he died. I was with Chris the night before he died. I was with Jimmy the week before he died. So I just had to watch these friends of mine succumb to illness and leave the planet.
You've been very fortunate along the way that you've had Kay by your side.
Yep.
Not only as a life partner, but also as a bandmate for many years.
Yes.
And your son Max.
Yep.
is a muso
Yep.
as well. You must look back and you think, along with the bad, there's been so much good.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And having Max involved in the industry is kind of cool. I can see his path in, and if he asks me, I'll give him advice. Sometimes with kids, they don't really want your advice, even if they've been in the business for 50 years. He's been in Japan for 6 weeks, and now he's going to London for 5 weeks. So he's in the middle of it and doing great stuff. It's always good to see what he's doing. And Kay and I, we still write songs and we still play and do stuff. So, it's not as if I'm not involved in it. Yeah.
I've got to ask one last question, mate. What's a kerosene flambe?
Don Walker's Kerosene Flambe. I played in the first incarnation of Catfish with Don Walker, and it was the first time that Don had stepped out the front and he was singing. He didn't have a piano. We had a band. Charlie Owen was in it, and Dave Blight plays the harp in Cold Chisel. He was in it.
Plays harmonica. Yep.
And Paul Burton was a bass player, and we had this little band, and we were in Brisbane. We're at the A1 Motel. And we're staying there, and they had a little dining room, and we decided that we'd sit there and have a band dinner, and we're all sitting there. And the guy that ran it was a bit like a Basil Fawlty. He was a bit kind of arrogant.
Okay.
He used to treat people badly. He was kind of a bit of a weird guy. And anyway, we got to the dessert menu, and I saw flambe fruit, and I went, that sounds pretty cool, and Don said, yeah, flambe fruit. Let's have flambe fruit, that'd be good. So he comes over and I said, we'll have the flambe fruit, thanks. And he comes back with this little, arrangement for the flambe, and I'm smelling it. I'm going, that smells like kerosene, mate. That smells like kerosene. And he said, no, that's how you flambe fruit. I said, no, I think you use alcohol. I don't think you use kerosene, mate. He said, no, this is right. So he lights it up in this restaurant, and there's a big black plume of smoke coming up from the kerosene in onto the roof. All the people are coughing and spluttering, and he's sort of going, oh, what do we do? And I just grabbed a napkin and stuck it over the top of it. I said, that's how you do it, mate. Now, take it away. He said, well, don't you ruin my bloody napkin. I said, you're trying to burn us down, mate, So that's the story of the flambe fruit.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Buzz, look, thanks very much for joining us, mate.
My pleasure.
Graham Buzz Bidstrup. The book is called No Secrets, an Oz Rock Memoir of Music and Mayhem. And it's certainly that. It's a great read. Buzz, thanks very much for joining us here on the breakdown.net, mate. And
Lovely.
Good luck with everything.